The governor conditionally vetoed S5, which was the measure that gave the police and fire the control of their system. And he made some recommendations. What was your participation in those recommendations?
As I think was in the governor's budget, in the message that was attached to the CV, Department of Treasury, Pensions Office, and staff did weigh in on some of the concerns about S5, and I think it was made clear in his message that was attached to the CV.
Well, let me ask you more specifically. Every one of the public employees in this room, save the police and fire, based on the conditional veto and assuming that it's passed, has a safeguard for the funding target. Now, I'm only been in this business about 35 years, and I can't really ascertain what, I guess, let me just read it to be sure, because I've never noticed it as an actuarial term before, that it will be that the change will not adversely affect the plans for the long term. Not impair the plan for the long term. I've never seen that in a plan document or in a pension pamphlet or a handout. It says that they only have to demonstrate that they don't have to have this impairment or damage to the plan for 1 year. The reason why I'm asking is that there was we had a discussion that safeguards need to be required for S5. I think you and I talked about it, or some of your staff. And every system, save this one, will have that protection that they can't make any change to the system unless they maintain an 80% funding level. Now, I know just actually from your office, when I asked you to run the numbers, what the cost of living addition to the plan would be, and it's $9 billion in unfunded and about $900 million in cost. And the police and fire made sure that that particular provision, meaning the 80% funding target, was not required in this CV and in their legislation, because ideally they would like to get back to getting their cost of living, which every public employee in here will not be able to get to unless they're 80% funded. Did you have any input on whether or not the 80% funding level was required?
Well, I believe the legislation as passed did not, by both houses, did not include anything about the 80% funding, so that the CV, by putting this language in, brings the long-term viability of the fund into account, which sort of kind of covers the area. I think the intention is to make sure that the fund is viable moving forward, which would mean that it has a good funding level before COLAs would be put into place.
Well, there's no number that's assigned to that viability. There's
Correct.
no definition in the actuarial community of viability without having a funding target. That's why we have them in all the different codes that are enforced by the Internal Revenue Service. That's the key component. Right now, they say that parts of the plan are 31% funded, and quite honestly, the governor's contribution, yes, though the largest in history, is primarily because unfunded that's also being amortized is the largest in history, which is part and parcel, and actually the majority of that contribution, that unfunded, all these things that haven't been paid. So my concern is this, is the conditional veto that was done by the governor. What was the participation of the Treasury Department? Because it was important that the 80% funding target be included. I know it wasn't in the original bill. It was taken out, specifically removed from Chapter 78, and Chapter 78 language was specifically taken out of the bill so that they would not have that limitation before they can implement that again. That's a safeguard that, honestly, the legislature fought hard to put into place for all those systems. Back in 2011, paid all that political capital to get it done. And then, at this point, we're now removing that limitation and not putting it back. The governor had the opportunity at this point to put that safeguard back in, and he chose not to. I was just wondering if you had any thoughts or input on that basis.
Well, the CV did also add the requirement for a supermajority and also added the requirement that an actuary would have to certify for the change to take place.
The actuary will certify what the event and what the result of the change would be. Actuarial,
Which would give an indication of the long-term viability of the fund.
well, yes and no. Phase-ins go over many, many years. And quite frankly, you would have no way to project what actual events occur. That's why we have expected unfunded and actual unfunded. That's why we have an unfunded liability, because you have good years and bad years. But my point is this, is that the legislatures thought in 2011 that it was important enough to put in that number for all the systems. And this legislation was passed taking that particular safeguard out. My question is very specifically, was your office consulted on that particular issue, the 80% funding level?
The office was consulted on the bill, as I mentioned, and it's clear in the governor's message that's attached to the CV that the Treasury Department provided advice on the bill, and there were safeguards that were put in place in the CV, which is why it was CV'd.
I understand that. Did you recommend the 80% or not?
The governor did the CV, and the language in the CV was what was determined would be put in, and that's it.
It's just a yes or no. Did you have any input about 80% funding target for this CV, to put that language back in?
We discussed the viability of the fund, and this was the language that was determined to be placed in the bill.
That would be no then?
What's that?
You did not bring up the 80% funding target or recommended that be put back in?
Me personally?
No, your entire...
Our office, I wasn't involved personally in all of the discussions regarding this, so I do not know what took place in terms of...
Could you find that out for me and get it through the chair?
We could find out.
Thank you very much. The other point is that you say the safeguards were put in, the viability of the plan, but there were a couple of changes. One, that the rate of return was going to be established by the treasurer. Thank you. Not by the actuary that worked for the fund. Obviously, you want to have checks and balances there. Also, that the experience study that's done every 3 years for all the plans would be done by an actuary that's selected by the treasurer. And I spent 21 years on the actuarial selection committee, and so that you'd have that check and balance. It would not have, no one fund would have power to select one actuary over another. Unfortunately, the CV left that particular provision for the most important actuary in the hands of the Board of Trustees, that the Board of Trustees would have the fate of that particular independent contractor, which really just means who pays your Social Security tax. He wouldn't be an employee, but he'd be a contractor, but they have the right to hire and fire or not select. Did anyone think that that particular selection process should either return to the selection committee or the treasurer, since that is such a viable, important role that the actuary plays in that particular plan?
Get back to you on that also.
Okay, thank you very much. Nothing more, Madam Chair.